Botulism. It's like the scariest, most dangerous part of this hobby, right? Right? I mean, right? Actually, no, you're not gonna get botulism or really any bad bacteria, spoilage, microbe-related illness from homebrewing. Now bear with me here. I'm gonna answer this question for you right away. I try not to bury the lead in my videos and waste your time. Oh, and by the way, be sure to go check out the article I've written on this topic over on the website. You are not gonna get botulism or any kind of like bad bacteria, spoilage related sickness from consuming homemade alcohol. Like it's basically guaranteed, 100% impossible under any kind of remotely reasonable situation. And if you've done something so wildly, outlandishly unreasonable that you've created an opportunity for botulism, you probably know what you're doing. You're probably an expert, you probably did this intentionally with a purpose, and you probably know the risks. And so any kind of accidental thing you've done, like leaving the lid loose or letting the airlock run dry or not having perfect sanitization practices, that's not gonna end up in botulism. You might get an infection, but in this hobby, the word infection is generally used with air quotes. The word infection sounds scary, but it really just means that something got in there that you didn't intend to be in there. Bad stuff like the botulism bacteria can't survive in a fermented beverage. So what you're usually dealing with an infection is like a souring bacteria like lacto or pediococcus, which by the way, we seek out in other foods for, gut health. Or like wild yeast, which is literally just the same thing you pitch into your batch to make alcohol. It's just a wild strain. And these things can cause like sour or funky flavors that could be good or bad, and most definitely won't be what you expected from your recipe, but they're not gonna hurt you. The one caveat is mold. If you have mold, that's definitely bad. But if you have mold, it's mold. You see it, you know it's mold. Just dump the batch and move on. So there's your answer. Don't go dump that next batch. And if you're happy to just take the word of some guy on the internet, you can turn the video off now and just go about your business. But I'm not gonna sit here and just say, trust me, bro. I wanna show you my research and my findings and the facts and the information so I can back this claim up and explain why this is the case. Now, I've been on both sides of this question. I still sometimes get asked, a botulism, when I hand somebody a bottle. But I also know this was like one of my biggest questions too when I first got started years and years ago. And what's interesting is none of the literature even seems to touch this question. I remember coming away from the book How to Brew by John Palmer, and I don't think the topic of food safety was presented once in that book. And so I ended up just kind of inferring that to prevent botulism and other stuff, you needed perfect sanitization. Because the book talks a lot about sanitization and perfect sanitization and how everything just needs to be clean. But then what about wild fermentation? Spontaneous fermentation. What did they do before modern sanitization practices? And so I would poke around on the old homebrew talk forums every now and again on the topic of wild fermentation. And people were always just like, just do it without explaining how or why. And so it was this weird, sort of mystery that fascinated me, and yet the answer was always kind of just out of reach. It seems like people who know the answer just kind of assume it's common knowledge, that everyone knows all the science behind food safety and homebrewing, and it's just obvious. So whenever the topic comes up, if it comes up at all, it just kind of gets glossed over and it's like, oh, homebrewing's safe. And then the people who don't know the science and information just kind of have to roll with that. And so they infer whatever, and then that's that. And so I've seen tons of people on Reddit and even other brew tubers dump perfectly good batches just because they don't know. And the implication here, and I think this is damaging to the perception of the hobby and how easy it is to get into it, is that any tiny mistake is a complete and catastrophic failure. And that's just not the case. It's actually the exact opposite. Because sanitization is not the reason for food safety. Sanitization is not even necessarily a critical part of the home brewing process. Now hold on a minute. It is important. You should be sanitizing everything. It's just not about food safety. Sanitization is not what prevents the bad bacteria and microbes from getting in your batch. It's the fermentation. Fermentation is the reason fermentation is safe. Home brewing is the reason home brewing is a safe hobby. It's actually one of, if not the, oldest and most effective food preservative methods that humans have come up with. Think about it this way. Just about every ancient human society discovered homebrewing independently without, external input. And we've been making alcohol like a lot for thousands and thousands of years. In our own kitchens, by the way, because big commercial macro breweries weren't a thing for most of that time. And modern sanitization and the knowledge that microbes even exist is a fairly new revelation, only since Louis Pasteur about 200 years ago. But before that, people were drinking beer and wine, and they weren't dropping dead left and right from botulism. If they were, I don't think alcohol would have ever caught on. Some historians believe that fermentation is the reason people stopped being hunter-gatherers and started grouping together in larger, agrarian towns and villages and such. And it's not because it gets us drunk. It tickles our monkey brain in a way that makes us feel good, but it's the food preservative mechanism that made it such a core facet of so many societies. Humans realized that they could grow more food than their large group could ever eat, and then before it rotted, just take up all that food, ferment it, and preserve the calories and nutrients basically indefinitely. So there's your real answer. Next time someone asks you, am I gonna get botulism from this? You tell them that story. That fermentation is actually a very effective food preservative method, and ancient people have been using it for way longer than any modern technique. Fermentation is actually very good at preventing botulism. In fact, it's so effective that in my research, I was only able to find a handful of recorded instances of individuals getting botulism poisoning from homemade alcohol. And each one of those handful of individuals links back to just two batches. And both of those batches were prison hooch. Now, I'm not talking about the subreddit, which is actually kind of a cool thing, where people talk about home brewing and keeping it simple and not trying to overcomplicate things. I'm talking about actual prisoners making actual prison hooch. And the thing about that is once you understand fermentation and how it works and why it's so good at preventing things like botulism, it starts to become pretty clear how this might have happened to these prisoners, and also why it would never happen to you. So stick around to the end of the video and I'll give you my thoughts and my explanation for what I think happened. And I'm not trying to string you along just to squeeze some more watch time out of you. In fact, I have chapters, so if you want, you can just skip right ahead and see the explanation right now. But I'd suggest sticking around because I don't think it'll make sense without all the sciencey stuff. So let's talk about that sciencey stuff. Now we're going to talk about botulism specifically today, if that's not already clear, because that's what people's minds seem to jump to most often. So all of the numbers, the metrics, the math, the facts, all of that, it's specific to botulism. However, the core concepts still apply more broadly to other bad bacteria. Now, botulism is actually something to be wary of in terms of general food safety, not so much homebrewing. I think it's one of the, if not the most dangerous, naturally occurring substances for humans. But don't worry, it's never gonna happen to you under any reasonable circumstance. Botulism starts out as a spore, and this spore is all around us. It's floating in the air, it's on every surface, it's inside you right now. But the spore itself is completely harmless. It just kind of floats there. The botulism spore, when it happens to land in an environment that's, perfect for the bacteria to thrive, that's when it starts producing the bacteria. And the bacteria by itself is also harmless. For the first, upwards of 3 days, it grows, it multiplies, and it grows up the colony, working to consume the resources and grab a foothold in the environment. And only once it's mature and it's established itself in its environment, then it starts producing the toxin. And the botulism bacteria has very specific requirements for what makes a good environment, before it can start producing the toxin, or before the spore can even start producing the bacteria in the first place. And these requirements go completely counter to the sort of environment that's created through fermentation. First off, the bacteria requires a relatively high pH above 4.6. Fermentation actively drops the pH into very acidic levels, often dropping it a full point within just the first few hours after it kicks off. Second, like most things, the bacteria doesn't exactly like alcohol. It needs a fairly low alcohol environment and can't really do its thing above like 6%. It's important to note that these two metrics, 4.6 and 6%, are not on-off switches. It's not like at 4.60001 and 5.999%, the bacteria is just spewing out the toxin, and then when one of those ticks over, it just shuts off. These two acts of fermentation work in tandem to fight off and suppress the bacteria. And as they approach these numbers, they do more and more and more to preserve and protect the batch. You can get close in both metrics and still be perfectly safe. So most of your musts from honey or fruit or whatever, those are already safe. They start out more acidic, down in like the 3 range before you even do fermentation. But with beer, we often target a fairly high mash pH of like 5.2, 5.3, even up to 5.8 sometimes. However, as long as fermentation kicks off within that like 3+ day lag phase window before the toxin gets produced, that'll take care of it. And I do mean kicks off. It doesn't need to finish in that 3 days. This seemed to be a point of confusion for some people over on Reddit when they read my original article. Remember, as long as fermentation kicks off in those 3 days, the pH will drop dramatically in just a couple of hours. And even that is mostly just good to know. You're probably never gonna have to worry about that. Modern yeast packets come with billions of healthy, viable cells, a full-blown colony ready to go right off the bat. You're gonna pitch your yeast, and it's gonna kick off in less than a day most of the time. And this is why for things like that Mtn Dew mead that Golden Hive made and later Clawhammer Supply did too, those are perfectly fine. The internet, particularly the mead subreddit, gotten all a tizzy over these experiments, especially when they added buffering agents and brought the pH up into like the 6s. But then they pitched healthy yeast and had a solid fermentation and never gave botulism a chance. So even in these outlandish experiments, it was still perfectly safe. Which brings me back to those prisoners. Now, the hospital records don't have a detailed description of what went into those batches, which makes sense, of course, why would they? But given what we now know about botulism and fermentation and prisons, we can infer some things. Prisoners aren't likely to have a jug of apple juice and a packet of dry bread yeast to make a simple fruit juice hooch like we did in that previous video. So these guys probably made up a wort from something grain-based, like potatoes or bread maybe, to give it a high pH. And then they would have probably set that out to catch some sort of wild yeast or something from the air. And so the nature of spontaneous fermentation is it can take a while. But if you leave out something grain-based with a high pH for that long, days, weeks, longer than 3-day lag phase, without fermentation starting, that's how you get bad bacteria in there. That's how you get botulism doing its thing. And this doesn't mean wild fermentation is bad. I mean, people do it all the time and have for all of history. But you don't want to leave something out with a high pH and try to catch wild yeast with that. Generally, from what I understand, wild fermentation is helped along in various ways. People often use fruit or honey to get it started, and it usually involves souring agents like lacto. So you know, maybe don't try to wild ferment that pH buffered Mtn Dew mead. But that's the thing though. This isn't ancient history. This isn't prison. Even if you're a minimalist from the Prison Hooch subreddit, you're still pitching your chosen yeast. And that gives you all of the advantage you need to keep your batch safe. And even if you're doing wild fermentation, first off, you're probably a little more advanced and kind of know what you're doing. But also, it's almost always safe, especially if you're making wine or mead or cider. So unless you're doing something just absolutely ridiculous, you don't really have anything to worry about. So yeah, there's your explanation. Fermentation is the reason why homemade alcohol is perfectly safe. And next time someone asks you, that's the answer you give them. But honestly these days, I usually just sum it up with that part about how it's our oldest preservative method. And it's pretty dang good at it. And that's usually enough for people to be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But now you know. And with that, you can rest assured that your batches are safe. Cheers.